Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It's 7 o'clock on Friday, the 24th of June. The people of Britain have voted to leave the European Union in an historic move that has stunned the rest of the continent.
They have decided that it is time to vote to take back control.
This is a dreadful day. It's one of the worst days of my life. To find my country leaving.
So what swayed it for you?
I don't know. I just suddenly had a real come on England.
We are part of Europe, continuing to interact with the peoples of other countries.
We work for this country. Look at my hands. You see it, yeah?
In a way that is open and friendly and outward-looking.
3% is not a majority. Let's do this again, one more time.
And the most precious thing this country has given our continent is the idea of parliamentary democracy.
I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
Shame on you, boys!
Young people in this country can look forward to a more secure and more prosperous future.
We couldn't have voted better. It's a long time coming. At least we get our country back now.
Jamie Dimon, Lloyd Blankfein, you want to take your troops from JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs to Paris to the Boulevard Haussmann? Have a lovely holiday. Because I'll give you a clue, guys, you'll be back.
That was the thing. Do not vote for fear, vote for hope.
You can't vote for hope. There's no hope nowadays.
We believe in a union not just between the nations of the United Kingdom, but between all of our citizens, every one of us, whoever we are and wherever we're from.
Hello, it's exactly a month since Referendum Day, June the 23rd, the day everything changed. There's been so much to take in on Newsnight, we barely had time to cover it all, so today we've been taking stock. We're here at the Royal Geographical Society in London, live. We've teamed up with Intelligence Squared and gathered some of the country's top brains with an audience of about 700 foolhardy members of the public on this stiflingly warm evening, and we're trying to make sense of what has happened and what's next.
The conversation and the debate this afternoon has been both sparky and sparkling. Everything on the future of scientific research in a Brexit world and what will happen to laws such as the European arrest warrant and cybersecurity. And now that Theresa May has raised it, the possible issues of EU nationals already in the UK remaining and UK nationals in Europe. So we've been asking people for their hopes and fears.
The danger is that we're going through a period of economic crisis where those who voted leave will be the ones who will pay the greatest price.
My fear is that the people who voted for Brexit are going to be sourly disappointed when the Tory government does what the City of London wants, which is basically remains in the single market and has to accept some elements of free movement, I think.
I'm optimistic because I believe the character of the British people will carry us through to better times.
I think most people voted because they wanted to take back control from the European Union and let our own country govern itself again. And that offers a whole world of opportunity, both in terms of our social policy, in terms of our economic policy too.
Well, I think for me, my hopes and fears are centred around the impact it will have on my education, because I really was looking to study languages in perhaps France or Spain.
I fear about there'll be less interest in environmental concerns.
I think my hopes for Brexit are that we leave the EU as safely as we can with minimal damage.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talking here all day. Now, look, we'll be doing some more in the programme, but before we look ahead, we want to spend a few minutes looking back at the referendum campaign itself. It was easily one of the most memorable contests of our lifetime, a surprisingly divisive and fraught affair. Both sides accused the other of lying or exaggerating, but even though the public, by all accounts, was sceptical of the claims made, they were engaged. I can remember someone involved on one side saying that the turnout would be low, it would be lucky if it reached 60%. In the event, it was over 70. But at the end of it, one side won, the other side lost. Now, it's important to know how and why Leave did win in order to interpret the message the public was sending. Our political editor, Nick Watt, has been talking to those at the heart of the campaigns and has this, the inside story of why Leave prevailed.
If Boris Johnson looked surprised and a little shaken hours after Vote Leave's historic victory, that's because he was. Newsnight understands that as voters went to the polls, Boris thought that his campaign was probably headed for defeat. He had even drafted a series of remarks in response to an expected narrow loss in the referendum. So how did the Prime Minister end up on the losing side? When David Cameron took a gamble by calling the referendum, Boris Johnson had some sympathy for his view that it would be third time lucky for the Prime Minister. He had won the Scottish and the general election. Behind the scenes, though, on the Remain side, there was never any complacency. Alarm bells started to ring for some shortly after the general election last year, when the leaders of the main pro-EU group were asked at a board meeting at this building here to name their 10 favourite things about the EU. There was silence around the table. For the true believers, the benefits of the EU were simply beyond description.
Back in 2015, in April, we got our first research from Populous, who were our pollsters throughout the campaign. And it showed that people knew all the negative arguments about the EU, and they couldn't name a single positive about what the EU meant.
The Remain camp soon found that they had to contend with a simple but highly effective message from their opponents.
The actual sort of genius moment came in August of last year, when we were actually sitting in the office over in Westminster Tower over there. Half of the office was a building site at that point, and the other half we were sort of working in trestle tables and what have you. That's when Dominic had the moment. He said the message has to be Vote Leave, take control. And that developed into Vote Leave, take back control. We knew it was a message that would cut through.
David Cameron had been confident that the Tories' star player would be on his side, but Boris Johnson alerted the Prime Minister of his plan to join the Leave campaign shortly before his formal announcement.
Had it just been me, we'd have lost. It's quite simple. You know, you have to have different messengers. I think there was little doubt that you know, the Boris voice, the Michael Gove voice, probably was very useful in parts of Surrey and places. No, really, in places like that, where perhaps naturally, you know, Remain might have got a bigger vote, and where I wouldn't necessarily have appealed to those people.
Boris has an extraordinary ability to attract crowds in a way which, you know, you wouldn't dare to stage manage. The first time out, and we're given these 2 ice creams. This woman just comes up and goes up to Boris and says, "Oh, Mr. Johnson, can I eat your ice cream, please?"
There you go. It's a delicious ice cream, right?
While the Leave campaign had a showbiz feel, the government had the international big guns. Barack Obama used a visit to London to warn that the UK would, in a distinctly un-American phrase, be at the back of the queue in securing a trade deal outside the EU. Shortly after the Obama visit, the Leave campaigners gathered in Boris Johnson's Westminster office to assess the state of play over a Chinese takeaway.
We came under barrage after barrage of artillery fire from the IMF, from the OECD, from the Bank of England. Obama came over late April. And I remember having dinner with, I think it was Boris, Michael, Priti, Andrew Leadsom, and we had a kind of tour de table on what we thought would happen. And I said then, I thought we would win because they'd fired all of this stuff at us and we were neck and neck.
But the Remain campaign thought they were on strong ground as they highlighted their opponent's claim about how much money the UK sends to the EU.
The £350 million figure was devastatingly effective. The last thing that we wanted to do was to get into an argument on television with the Leave campaign about whether the real figure was 350 million or 170 million or 210 million, because all those numbers sound huge. Our challenge was to try to find a number that trumped it as a number that captured the benefits of being in for our economy and for people, and therefore the risks of leaving, and that we failed to do.
Every time they kept quibbling with us about it, we kept making the positive case for control over our borders, over control over our money, and it just gave us another 24 hours talking about an issue that people cared about and where we were on the right side of the debate. You're not going to give that up.
Morning, everyone.
Nerves soon developed in the Remain campaign over a government claim about the economic impact of Brexit on the average household.
The problem with that figure, the £4,300 figure, was firstly it sounded implausibly large to the ears of most people. Secondly, it sounded strangely specific. The figure was sort of humanely phased out because we found, when we tested the reaction in focus groups, we found people just rejected it. They didn't believe it.
The Remain camp also became increasingly aware that its core message about the wider economic risks of an exit meant nothing in deprived areas where concerns about immigration were to the fore.
The people who were very, very concerned about immigration, what they wanted was purely and simply for the UK to be able to have total control of its borders and total control of the flow of people into this country. And we didn't have an argument that could remotely compete with that. It meant we couldn't really engage in the campaign on that vital issue. We didn't have much option but to keep trying to pivot back to the economic risks.
With a month to go until polling day, the Remain campaign really lost its momentum when the government machinery was obliged to grind to a halt. This coincided with the release of official figures, which showed that the government had once again bust its net migration target. Vote Leave had days of dream headlines. With the polls turning in Vote Leave's favour, I understand that in mid-June a nervous David Cameron discussed with aides in Number 10 a last throw of the dice to rescue his campaign by reaching out to disgruntled voters on EU migration. The Prime Minister telephoned the German Chancellor Angela Merkel as a first step towards persuading other EU leaders to issue a joint statement. This would have said that a vote to remain in the EU would finally trigger concessions on the highly controversial issue of free movement of people. Nothing came of the idea. Merkel was later to tell David Cameron there could be no compromise on free movement, while Number 10 concluded that such a dramatic move would be portrayed by the Leave side as a sign of weakness. But a week before polling day, the campaign came to an unexpected halt when news came through of the murder of the Labour MP Jo Cox, hours after UKIP had unveiled a highly controversial poster.
I don't think that poster would have been a big news event over that weekend had it not been for the timing of it and the circumstances of that death. After all, I mean, that particular picture was all over the front pages of our newspapers last year. I'm very sorry for the timing of that poster. I'm sorry for the way in which it was used. I'm not sorry for showing the truth, but perhaps unwittingly, it did in the end get the debate back for the last few days onto the one thing that people out there really, really care about.
The official Vote Leave campaign were appalled by the poster.
I was actually in the middle of a debate at York University when all of a sudden I was getting text messages through on my phone about Jo Cox's murder. And when I got the news through that he was shouting Britain first, I really thought it could have been the end of the campaign, because the mixture of Jo Cox's death plus the unveiling of the very controversial UKIP poster Breaking Point, I thought could actually tip us over the edge.
The two sides briefly suspended their campaigns after the death of Jo Cox, but hostilities resumed in time for the final television showdown days before the vote.
For me, it was really clear during the preparation sessions for the TV debates. I was playing the role of Andrea Leadsom. What was really clear was that they had one simple phrase and they just kept repeating it. And it allowed them to have an answer to anybody's concerns over anything, whether you fear for your job, whether you don't like the government, whether you have concerns over pressures on public services. Vote Leave, take back control. Really simple.
The Remain side also believed that Jeremy Corbyn's less than enthusiastic support undermined their campaign.
It was a nightmare not to have greater engagement from the leader of the Labour Party. The Labour Party made up the bulk of Remain voters. It was absolutely critical to get our message to them, and what we found and were frustrated by was how hard it was to engage with Jeremy Corbyn's office, how difficult it was to get meetings.
The Leave side triumphed after David Cameron lost his gamble. In the end, the desire to win back control over immigration trumped fears about economic uncertainty. And unnerved Boris Johnson went out of his way to say that the UK may be leaving the EU, but it would always embrace Europe.
Well, I dare say communication studies theses will be written on that campaign and what won it. That was Nick Watt. Well, here with us now, former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, the Labour MP Stella Creasy, and Conservative and Leave campaigner Kwasi Kwarteng. Good evening to you all. Nick Clegg, essentially there was no answer to the immigration issue in the campaign. I just wonder whether you think that in the end was what won it for Leave.
Well, it was a mixture of things. I think that when a lot of people were asked, certainly I experienced this in Sheffield and South Yorkshire, where I was canvassing and campaigning, a lot of people who were asked, do you like the status quo, said, well, I don't. And I think there was a whole bunch of reasons. Immigration, poor housing, they couldn't get their elderly parents into decent social care. It was just a very simple, do you like the way things are, yes or no? And a lot of people said no. And I think, that and many other reasons lie behind the big vote to leave.
But as a sort of tactical thing, shouldn't they have thought what the answer to the immigration question? Yeah, had a line
my own view is some declaration which the Brexit camp would have been able to shoot holes in within minutes from European leaders press-ganged at the last minute to say something vaguely helpful to Cameron wouldn't have worked. My own view was that the Remain camp should have been much, much more aggressive at challenging the Brexit campaign about what on earth they mean, because the immigration refrain went unchallenged. Just this week, we've had the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, saying very clearly there will not be hard controls on our new land border with the EU. So how on earth are we supposed to take back control if we're not going to reintroduce controls at the new border with the EU? And all of that was left unchallenged because the Remain camp didn't want to take on the issue of immigration. I think they could have done so more self-confidently and aggressively than they did.
Right. Stella, can I just ask you about your party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and his role? What did you think of his... was he part of the reason why Remain didn't win? Because there were lots of people in Labour areas who didn't vote Remain, although lots did.
Look, I have to say on a personal level, it hurts. It hurts to see that actually something we decided as a political movement was something we felt strongly enough for it to be official policy, not getting the backing of the leader. That doesn't mean that Jeremy personally could have got every single Labour voter to vote Remain, and we have to recognise lots of people who normally vote Labour did vote to leave. But it's about the contract that you make as a political movement and the trust that you have that actually once you agree something is a party policy, you put your heart and soul into it. And, I went around the country, many of us worked very hard to try and get a Remain vote, to try and counter some of the arguments that Nick is talking about, to recognise that we have a country that is so very divided now and how we were going to take it forward. And it felt like Jeremy had benched himself in that process. And I've got to say, on an honest personal level, that hurt, because when it's something that isn't a general election, this is something so fundamental, to not get that heart and soul from your leader is devastating.
OK, well, look, let's not talk too much about the campaign. Let's talk about what the voters were saying. And Nick, you gave a kind of an account. It was a sort of a vote against the status quo. Stella, I think you're saying almost the same thing. There was a bit of that about it. Kwasi Kwarteng, as a Leaver, what do you think the voters were saying? Was it really about the EU specifically, or was it a bigger protest of some kind?
I think what Nick said is true. There's a lot of truth in saying that there were a number of issues. There's never one reason why voters make a particular decision. But I think we can't gloss over the fact that the whole issue of EU membership
was exactly what it said it was. I mean, people knew that they were going to have to vote. They knew that if we voted to stay in, we would probably not revisit this question for another 25 years. They felt it was a once-in-a-lifetime vote. I think they were very clear-eyed about whether they wanted to stay in, certainly in my constituency, which voted 60-40 out. And they made a rational choice. And they said, you know what, we'd rather leave. We don't want to stay, and we want out.
What do you read into that, Kwasi? I mean, was it immigration? Was it take back control and perhaps what you might call sovereignty, or that sense of empowerment that you might get by being able to kick out your politicians?
The two biggest issues were clearly immigration and also this broader, more abstract sense of sovereignty, taking back control. Now, we can have a philosophical argument about what sovereignty is, but the people, certainly people in my constituency, felt that by leaving the EU, they were reasserting some degree of...
Was it 60% immigration, 40 sovereignty, 70...
I mean, I've seen some polling data. I suspect that about sort of 70% were one of those two issues. Right. I mean, those were by far and away the two biggest issues.
And do you agree with that, Nick?
That what?
Well, that those two issues played a big part, or do you just think neither, you can't put it down into any one of them?
I think it's very difficult to reduce things. I tell you what I do think emerged during the course of the campaign was that, as your film suggested, the emotional appeal of the Brexit campaign was strong. I heard it myself, people saying, I'm going to vote no, take back control. It was a wonderfully pithy, emotive appeal, and generally I've discovered in politics people vote with their hearts rather than their heads, and you know, a sort of barrage of statistics from the Treasury saying that in 30 years' time your household finances may or may not be you know, worth this or that. It just couldn't compete. And I have to say I felt a very pivotal moment was when George Osborne, I think, in a spectacularly misjudged initiative, basically announced about a week or so before the referendum that if people didn't do what he told them to do, he'd whack up their taxes or cut their public services. I almost felt like voting out at that point. So I thought, well, you know, and so I think the appeal to people's hearts was much stronger. And of course, it's easy for me as a lifelong European to say this, but I sometimes wish a bit of poetry could have been mixed in with the prose of the Remain campaign.
It's really important we understand whether immigration, whether the public saw this as a vote on immigration, Stella, because we're going to be making some decisions, I'm going to ask you about them. We're going to make decisions in which whether immigration is the core of it or sovereignty is the core of it really matters. So now, do you think, Stella, immigration, have we just had a vote against
immigration? I don't think we can get away from this. One of the moments that really broke my heart in my local community, Walthamstow has always been a place that's been proud of its diversity, and I watched a Somali woman racially abusing a Hungarian woman, shouting at her that her daughter couldn't get a job, so she should go back to the country where she came from. And I knew then that the divisive rhetoric of the Leave campaign had ramifications far beyond the vote around Brexit. Now, absolutely, what they tapped into is a divide within this country between the people who feel they have a place in our future and know how they're going to make it, and the people who don't feel they have a place in our future. That is a challenge for all of us to deal with.
You can't suggest that 52% of people in Britain who voted out feel they don't have a stake in the future. I mean, that wasn't the case in my constituency. I know
I think you
that
have
your
to
constituency is
recognise
very
that
different.
people felt they had nothing left to lose, and that played a big part.
Well,
that kind of sense
that
the status quo doesn't work.
There's a narrative building up about Labour voters. The reason, and I was talking to Nick about this earlier, 58% of Tory voters, not members, 58% of Tory voters in the country voted out. And that was a huge chunk of the Leave vote. So, and a lot of these people are not people who feel they have no stake or they have nothing to lose. They are people who made a rational choice about the future of this country.
They are people who feel that politics works for them
They
and
are
with
people,
them. Because that is the question for us, isn't it? Is whether people actually feel the big changes we've got coming in front of us, and now we've got some really big, difficult choices in front of us. Do they feel the political process works with them, brings them into it, listens to them, engages with them, or do they not? Because that's the challenge for all of us.
I think there were lots of people in that. I actually did in the course of the campaign an event in your father's constituency, in Nick's father's constituency. I think he was in the audience, and these were not people. I think it's in Buckinghamshire, isn't it? That's where he lives. And these were people who were overwhelmingly voting to leave the EU, and they were people who had
not my dad.
A stake, not your father, no.
Right, look, I do want us to...
But that's overlooked.
I'd like to understand. There's no one explanation, Kwasi.
It's always overlooked in this discussion. It's always portrayed as people who had no stake or
We've had a big discussion today, and a lot of that...
and it's not the case.
There was
an element
interesting,
of it, but it's not the whole story.
A lot of towns that had great industries and had lost them often did vote to leave. Look, let's just quickly talk about models of where we go from here, because it appears that where we are is in making a choice between a Brexit light or a hard Brexit. There's a sort of stay in the single market and accept free movement, or say, look, immigration is what it's all about. So you've got to get out of the single market, give up on the single market to control immigration. Kwasi, in 2 sentences, where are you on that?
My red line, fundamental red line, is a control on freedom of movement, some concession. And in fact, I was just speaking earlier, when I decided to go for Brexit, I was always Eurosceptic. I wasn't like Daniel Hannan or some of the other more forceful Eurosceptics. But when the Prime Minister, David Cameron, failed to get any concession whatsoever on the freedom of movement, that was the moment, I think, in February, that I decided to vote leave.
Stella,
and that was fundamental.
Stella, where are you on that trade-off? Do we accept immigration has to be controlled more?
I think there is a conversation about what do we mean by freedom of movement of labour and how you define labour, the skills and abilities that people bring to countries. But fundamentally, access to the single market is massive for our economy. You know, it's not popular to talk about the city, but that's 30% of our tax receipts. So we've got to make some really clear and hard-headed choices now about what is going to help people. Because those people we're talking about are people who were left behind well before this happened. You know, the honest truth about how we get them the good skills, the good jobs, we get the investment in those communities has to be at the heart of any decision made next.
Brexit light, basically, stay in the single market even if there's a cost.
That's Stella's view.
You're Brexit, you're a little more hard-headed. But let's hear Nick's view.
Because I want jobs.
Kwasi, let's hear Nick's view.
Kwasi's new party leader has said what she wants. She said in Paris and in Berlin very clearly, said it twice, must have chosen her words very carefully. She said the United Kingdom will now seek, and I quote, the closest possible economic relationship with the European Union. The closest possible economic relationship with the European Union that we have at present. In other words...
And you're happy with that? You're happy with
yes,
that?
I am, because I think at the end of the day, we're talking about people's lives here and their jobs and their ability to pay their bills. And I think the closest possible economic relationship is something akin to, or maybe even better than, what Norway has got. But can I just say very briefly, because there's been a lot of, quite rightly, discussion about the trade-off between single market and freedom of movement. The thing that the government needs to decide, when they finally put us all out of our misery and tell us what their plan is, they've got to be upfront about this. If you want to have unlimited or extensive access to the single market, you can only do so by abiding by the rules and the rulings of the single market. I would call that a loss of sovereignty, but there's no way around that. If you want to trade into the single market, you have to abide by the rules of it, and that's something which this government will have to come clean with at some point.
I do just want to go to the audience here. We have a lovely audience in the room. They've been at events through the day. Now, I have to tell you, it was a first come, first served, buy a ticket event. So this is not like a usual BBC audience, which has been constructed to be in some way balanced. And it is, we know from the rest of the day, overwhelmingly Remain. This is a West London venue. So it's a Remain. But what I did want to just ask the audience, because there was a splendid piece by Matthew Parris in the Times today that kind of talked about Remainer grief. And we've had a fair bit of that in the room today. And he was saying, you have to accept the result. And what I wanted to just ask our audience here is whether you basically accept the result. It's time to make the best of Brexit, or whether you believe it's time, you know, to fight and see if you can get the referendum reversed. How many of you would say it's time to accept the result and make the best of Brexit? And how many of you would say fight and see if you can get the thing reversed? Yeah, I would say sort of 60-40 in favour of Remain.
You ask how many people here actually think they know what Brexit will be?
Well, it's going to be a while. Well, let me put that. Let me just ask, I mean, Stella, do you think we should have a second referendum when we know what Brexit means?
Listen, I think, yes, we have to respect the fact that that's the result, and we have to deal with the result, all of us, whether we were for it or against it. But it's the small print and the detail, because as you've already said, there are big choices. If we don't have access to the single market, that's 30% of our tax receipts. If we're going to change freedom of movement, that could lead to changes.
The 30% isn't all going to disappear.
How do you know? How do you know?
The City of London.
How do you know? Don't these people now deserve? They voted.
Let's ask a few of them.
But they now deserve the detail.
I just want to get a couple of views from the floor. We haven't got time to get many, but I know we've got a group around a microphone over there. Marla, where's Marla? Come on, Marla. What's your view on the second referendum issue, or some way of getting back?
Well, I was one of the 4 million plus who actually petitioned for a second referendum, because I was hoping that the majority would now accept the importance of staying in the EU, which I think is so vital for the future of Britain for so many aspects, including my own personal interest in the future of medical research and the British university system where I work.
Okay, where you work. Howard, where's Howard? Howard, you're wearing a Leave.eu shirt, so I think we know which side you're coming from. What do you think when you hear Remainers, 40% or so, say we need to have it best of three or have another go on this?
Well, I'm a Democrat, so government is governing with the consent of the population. The referendum gave the population the opportunity to say that they do not have the consent of the situation as it is at the moment. If the Parliament decides that we have a proposal for how to change, it may be that the electorate should be given the opportunity to demonstrate their consent.
So you would even
rejection.
tolerate, you're slightly untypical, I think, because you're thinking, even though the Leaver, you might want to sort of put the consent back at the end of the whole process.
I'm very aware that Parliament is 75% Remain, so
okay. Let me just qualify, would you accept any kind of subsequent look of this? Brexit means Brexit, but if it turns out to be rubbish when we see what it actually is...
I wouldn't endorse a second referendum, but I'll say this. There seems to be a sort of confidence, almost an arrogance on the part of the Remain team, that if there were a second referendum, they would get the result that they wanted. I mean, if they didn't do that, then, I mean, they would have to leave the pitch and abide by the result. And my suspicion, going around my constituency, is that actually the Leave vote has hardened and people have been appalled at the condescension and the arrogance with which many Remainers, not Stella or Nick, forgive me, or your dad,
Sorry.
or your dad,
Kwasi, Stella, Nick, thank you all very much indeed. Can we thank the panel, please? Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Thank you.
As you just said, it is all very well discussing this here, but what's it like in the north of England and the Midlands, where many voted to leave and many of those who did vote to leave were Labour voters? Katie Razzle has been travelling from the industrial city of Manchester to the holiday town of Blackpool.
One month on from Brexit, what did the vote reveal about Britain?
Our new Prime Minister talked about one nation, but are we?
Even in Manchester, where 60% voted to remain, there are divisions.
You've got all sorts of famous clients, haven't you?
Yeah, it's Lady Gaga, Tess Daly, Cheryl Cole, Amanda Holden.
Turkish-born designer Zeynep Kartel voted to leave. Her design team was split.
Have you experienced a feeling that because you voted out, people are judging you in some way?
Of course, yeah.
In what way?
It's just all over Facebook. Like, every time anyone would comment something, especially like within our generation, I felt like it's embarrassing to say that you voted out, because people would just be like, oh my God, I can't believe you've done this, blah, blah, blah.
It feels like we're quite divided at the moment. Do you think we can heal?
I think it all depends on the Brexit strategy and what happens now, and whether we can sort of meet a mutual agreement that's going to work for everyone.
The referendum revealed fault lines in the country, class, age and geographical divides.
This is a city that voted in, and yet we're going out.
Yeah.
And people are worried, are they?
They're very worried, because I think, to be honest with you, the politicians, they didn't explain very well to the people what the effect will be after the elections.
Well, one of the truths universally acknowledged during the campaign is that students mainly voted in. And there's a bar down here that does student discounts. How did you vote?
Remain. Remain? Also Remain.
Do you feel part
of a metropolitan elite if you voted Remain? Is that how you see yourself?
The idea of 48% of the population being a metropolitan elite and 66% of Scotland being a metropolitan elite is ridiculous.
I think the great majority of people who voted out because they thought they had no control. They had no other choice. There's no other way to say what they wanted to say.
Have you felt, you know, anger, upset, dismay?
Dismissing people who voted in a different way from you as racist or uneducated is essentially the wrong way to go. It, in the long run, is going to do far more damage to the country than Brexit ever could.
Manchester and Liverpool are exceptional. Everywhere else around here voted out.
So I'm leaving Manchester now, off to visit some other parts of the northwest.
In Tory voting Ribble Valley, 56% voted Leave.
We've just intercepted you, John.
You have, haven't you?
Where are you off to?
They're from the paper.
John Proctor used to run Chipping's village shop. He voted to Remain.
And how do you feel about the result?
Well, they're a bit done at start. We've got to get used to it, don't we?
I took the good times.
Inside the shop, Barry White was about to be outshone.
I'm told that you're a good singer. Have you got any songs?
So if it's raining, I've no regrets. It's not raining, rain, you know. It's a bit of Al Jolson, that.
I like it. Do you think, and can I ask quickly, do you think it is raining as a result of the referendum, or are you happy with the way we've gone?
I'm happy with it. I am, yeah.
We'll all stick together, and if we all stick together and make a better future.
These parts are known as the milk fields of Lancashire. Outside the local cheesemakers, I found a family divided. Mum voted in, her daughters were split.
So you're scared about what the vote will mean for Britain?
Well, I am really, yeah. But as I say, I think Theresa May, of anybody, will possibly pull us through this.
We were all so aghast, especially me and my friends. We were just very upset, I think, and quite angry towards maybe the older generation. When I was speaking to Faye a few days after, it was more of a, are you happy that this has happened?
How did you feel? What did you say?
All my fault then. It's all my fault, that one decision.
You don't get more British than the seaside at Lytham St Anne's. At the local tea shop, I came across Hilda and Malcolm Bonner, both out voters.
Have you picked up a sort of sense, you know, I don't know, a kind of bad feeling between the people who voted out and the people who voted in?
I think some people are, you know, really biased and bigoted and can't always look for the other person's point of view, which is sad, really. Because, you know, we're all the same under the skin. We all have our own viewpoints, and hopefully we can all learn to live in peace together.
What do you say to young people who say you shouldn't have been allowed to vote because you're not going to be around to live with the consequences?
Well, I'd say a vote's a vote for everybody, and leave it at that.
I'm ending my trip in Blackpool with its darker underbelly behind the promise of bright lights. 68% of people voted out in Labour Blackpool, the highest figure in the northwest. At Amazing Grays, a soup kitchen 1 street back from Blackpool's Promenade, they offer 15,000 meals a year.
I think we should have left a long time ago.
Just tell me why you think out was the right vote.
Because I think it'll bring a lot more jobs back to Blackpool.
So you think as a result of the vote, things will get better for people like you here?
Yeah, all the jobs are being taken before the season even starts.
And is that by people who aren't from Blackpool, you think?
There's a lot of people moving into Blackpool all the time because they think it's like London, bright lights, big city. and it's not.
We've got a new Prime Minister. She's talking about one nation. She's appealing to people like you, saying, I'm going to think about you when I make a decision.
Well, a lot of people don't like her, but I think she might be pretty good, actually.
In this journey across the northwest, I've lost count of the number of times people have said to me from either side of the debate that they voted with the future in mind. In a sense, that's the thing that unites us, but it's also something that could divide us if the future doesn't pan out the way each of us hopes.
Katie Razzle. Well, I'm joined now by a leading Brexiteer, Daniel Hannan, Conservative MEP, who was one of the men who led the charge for Out, and the left-wing writer and commentator Paul Mason. First of all, what we've been hearing, and Katie Razzle explored that in the film, is the number of divisions and splits, which are within families, or between old and young, or across the country, or Scottish, English, so forth. That's an awful lot to heal, and you've got the troubles on the left.
I think we're not going to heal some of these divisions. The number one unhealable division is Scotland. If I was Scottish, I'd be voting right now to leave the United Kingdom and remain in the European Union. I think we overemphasize the generational thing. I think also something that I lament is a view that is common in a place like London, which is that all of this was caused by ignorance, xenophobia, etc. We cannot describe 52% of the population like that. Even the most visceral and voting with your heart leavism was often very well informed. My side lost, we have to accept it, and I think we will unite around what is the proposal? What is the proposal we're able to get from Europe? What's the maximum amount of engagement with the single market we can get?
But isn't that, that is the problem? A month on, and nature abhors a vacuum, that's for sure. But we are actually no clearer as to what that proposal may be. There may be some very bright young civil servants trying to work that out in the Brexit unit. But Daniel Hannan, you cannot tell the people in here what Brexit actually looks like because there is no prospectus.
Well, before the campaign began, we produced a 1 million-page study on what we would like to do. Now, of course, the reality is it was a very close vote, right? So we don't have a mandate to roll over 48%. That's as big a minority as you can have. As you correctly say, the UK is a partnership of nations. 2 of the 4 parts of the UK voted to remain in. We can't disregard that fact. So we may, if you like, the narrowness of the mandate will exert a measure of temperance, of moderation, because we need to try and find a consensus that both sides can at least live with, even if without great enthusiasm.
But one of the big issues, of course, I know, is that you believe passionately that immigration wasn't an issue. Clearly, your new Prime Minister does, because the thing that she said that nobody else had said was that the position of EU nationals in this country may be an issue. And so therefore that is now out on the table. And that is a division that will now exist. Yeah. People are very concerned. But families, friends.
What is it, opinion polls to say you can guess or we can ask, right? The BBC did its own poll about this, and 21% of Leave voters expect a very drastic fall in numbers of EU migrants after Brexit. 11% of all voters. So plainly this was not the top issue. What people wanted is a measure of control so that we're in charge of roughly who comes in and roughly in what numbers. That doesn't mean zero immigration.
I think for very bright people in here, the word roughly is a nightmare. Because actually, what does roughly mean? And you either have free movement of people or you don't. And Paul, immigration was very much an issue. In the northeast of England, Labour didn't get that one right. You may cede lots of votes to UKIP in the future because of that. But what are you going to do about the issue of free movement? It's not a bit of it. It's either free movement or not.
That's not true.
I agree with that. What I would do is, and I'm very strongly pushing this, is that we apply to be in the European Economic Area, to remain in the single market, and we say, because in it you can have an emergency break on free movement, that's only a temporary variance. We say we will address with microeconomic policies the things that people are worried about, give us time to do it, and the challenge has to be to everybody in politics, what is wrong with that? Tell us what you think is wrong with that, since you all claim to be pro-migration, not anti-migration, not racist. Tell us what is wrong with seeking EEA membership and then seeking some form of temporary breathing space to get the consent for migration back.
So, Daniel Hannan, in terms of healing divides, then you said, of course, it was a very narrow vote. It was a vote to leave, but it was a very narrow vote. So what do you think about that kind of model, the Norway model? Is that something that is seriously being considered or not?
So, first point, we're not going to copy any other country. I mean, throughout the campaign, people kept on saying, are you going to be like Norway or like Switzerland or like Guernsey or like Canada? The fact that you're putting the question like that shows that none of those two countries has an identical model. So it's silly to ask whom would we precisely mimic. Obviously, we're going to have our own deal.
But you nobody yet has come up with a model.
Well, in the what every country in Europe has in common, all of the non-EU countries, whether it's Macedonia, Isle of Man, all of them, Switzerland, Iceland, they all have access to the EU market without political union. So plainly, that we know the parameters within which these talks are going to happen. We want market access, we want some democratic control.
So there is going to be some free movement under this Conservative government, which is going to actually deal with Conservative MPs who are very concerned about this?
We made one absolutely clear promise, which was that we would take back control of immigration policy. That, in my mind, can mean only one thing. It means that no European court will get to determine who can enter the UK or who can reside in the UK. Having taken back control, it will, of course, be for the people and their parliamentarians to decide whether to have bilateral deals with other people, whether to allow people to come and study, to take up particular job offers. That will be something that will be for us to decide through our own democratic institutions.
And I'll talk about the democratic institutions in a moment. But Paul, when I talked about nature of power as a vacuum, you know, our revised growth figures for this year, 1.7, next year 1.3, you know, there may be an economic downturn which actually harms the very people who voted to leave.
It will. Look, if there's an economic downturn, it harms everybody. And what I am worried about is that, you know, racist populism is out of the bottle. You know, whatever Nigel Farage says now, he regrets using that image. We saw him earlier say that. Racist populism is there in pubs, in clubs. You know, if the economy now goes down the tubes, now I never bought the whole Bank of England Treasury kind of thing, but it could do.
Because they've all
absolutely, yeah. But and I said this publicly, but it may happen, and what we have to do now is to work together, not only to reassure those EU migrants, but, you know, a big backlash against Muslims happened on the street after this, who had nothing to do with EU membership. We have to all work to prevent this racist populism getting further out of the bottle.
Well, one word on that. Just a very quick word on that. On the question of bargaining with EU nationals that are here already, is that a goer or not?
Personally, I made clear all the way through we shouldn't put that in jeopardy. I think it's terribly unfair, by the way, to the many British Muslims who voted leave and campaiged leave to suggest that somehow they were, you know, they're lumped in with all these racists. I mean, they were making a rational, intelligent decision.
So when people here were asked in a show of hands whether or not when Brexit finally, as Stella Creasy said, what will Brexit be? Brexit is there. Do you believe then that you should put the Brexit plan to the people?
Brexit means that we end the jurisdiction of EU
the Brexit plan as designed. As you say, there isn't one at the moment, and there isn't a model.
The problem is that there isn't a plan. Of course, there's right. The problem is how much of it can we implement if we want to carry the people who are the Remainers who haven't accepted the result as we saw earlier. If we want to try and bring with us as many as possible of that 48%, then we may have to stop short of a complete severance and retain many more of our economic and military and diplomatic connections to the EU, including some institutional ones, for the sake of keeping the Union together and the sake of appeasing the whole country.
I have to say, right out of time for two of the more retiring characters of the whole EU campaign. Evan.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Well, that is actually about it for this evening. The temperature in here tells us we're getting into the deep summer, which is what the journalists call the silly season. Maybe you think it's all been a bit mad over the non-silly season, but I can tell you some of us are yearning for a period in which the biggest story is a cat stuck up a tree. Silly or not, many important decisions are going to be made over the next few months. We will continue to scrutinise them. Let me thank all of those involved in the day, the Royal Geographical Society for hosting us, and Intelligence Squared for helping us organise the event, and above all, to our audience here.
I've been getting away